if you work interactionally with couple, that is to say both spouses present, you find this thing going on all the time. But many times you find going on. For instance, the spouse may say, just a minute, just erase this here. So this out. Husband and wife. Now, their complaints are the following. The wife complains that the husband withdraws from her. The husband says, yes, this is true. I withdraw from you, but I withdraw only when you start nagging. And the wife, so the wife jumps out of her chair and says, this is not true because I only nag you when you withdraw. So what they are doing is really that the wife does something to the husband that he calls nagging. And the husband then does something to her which he calls withdrawing. And this goes on again in this kind of a frenetic fashion. Now, it is obvious that if we number these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, it is obvious that the husband sees triad 1, 2, 3. Right? Yeah. And the wife, on the other hand, only just here first. A mistake here. The husband does this to her. Right. In any case, the husband sees triad 1, 2, 3. She says this is not true. She sees triad 2, 3, 4. And this is how it goes on. In an interactional therapy, of course, you are faced with the problem of making them see that what they are doing is what Bates and Jackson called, they punctuate the sequence of events in a different way, in a discrepant way. Theoretically, all, in quotes, the therapist has to do is to make both partners see that in a way they're both right, but that they only see half of the picture. That really, if they could also see the correctness of the other person's perceptions, then there would be some chance of coming to some closure on this problem here.
That's very good thought. I remember for years always coming up often with like a phrase to a husband like, that there's a battle that's been going on here for many years, and you all are constantly spending your time arguing about who struck the first blow. And I say this is exactly the same thing you're talking about. Try and get them off this shift, off this trend of who it is that's about.
The interesting thing is that not even the queen of the sciences, not even mathematics, is safe of this thing here. For sure. The mathematician Bolzano, an Austrian priest, in 1848 wrote a little book called The Meaning of the Infinite, I believe. And in it, he said there is such a thing which later in mathematics was called the infinite series, infinite oscillating series. He says an infinite oscillating series S can be, in the most simple way, represented by this kind of a thing. A minus A plus A minus A plus A minus A, and so on, ad infinitum. Now, for our purposes, we could say, here is an interaction which consists in the oscillation between the message A, the assertion and negation of message A. Now, in mathematics, you can make the following mistake. You can say, I can punctuate by the means of brackets. I can punctuate this sequence to look like this, for instance. A minus A plus A minus A plus A minus A, and so on. Now you clearly see what this punctuation does. Because you get the following: A minus A is 0, plus 0 plus 0 plus 0. So the first outcome would be S equals 0. But you can do something else. You can punctuate it differently. You can say, all right, let's punctuate it this way. A minus A minus A minus A minus A, and so on. Again, this is correct. There's no one having changed anything here. And you see clearly now that now the outcome is S equals A. And you can do it in a third way. You can say S equals A minus A plus A minus A plus A minus A. And since what is here in the bracket is nothing but the sequence itself, we get S equals A minus S, 2S equals A, S equals A R. So even in mathematics, we have at least a nice model here of the kind of confusion that arises out of the discrepant or different punctuation of a sequence of events. Now, the mistake here, as well as in interaction between people, lies in the fact that, of course, you can't do this sort of a thing with an infinite series. The moment you introduce infinity into an equation, you have committed one of the cardinal sins of mathematics. And the couple that constantly argues a point back and forth in a similarly oscillating way, of course, also make the mistake of believing that their series has a beginning and an end, where in actual fact it doesn't, unless and until they come to some kind of a closure. Now, let me emphasize one thing once again, and that is that in a progressive kind of in a sequence of events, the kind we are looking at when we look at interactive behavior, in such a sequence, every behavior, every piece of behavior, every act of behavior changes, of course, the nature of the interaction in an almost irreversible sense, very much as the Greek, the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus put it so nicely: nobody can sleep with the same girl twice for the first time. Rather, he said, nobody can step into the same river twice. Now, let me give you just a few examples of where the punctuation of the sequence of events does really make a difference and has some therapeutic meaning, not just a theoretical one. For instance, I don't know. The same thing that I just mentioned about the different punctuation and therefore the attribution of different meaning to the other person's behavior can be observed in international conflict. Richardson, very early, basing himself on partly on Bateson's work for symmetry and complementarity, wrote the following about the arms race that began to escalate in about 1912, preceding, of course, World War I. The warlike preparations of the Entente and of the Alliance were both increasing. The usual explanation was then, and perhaps still is, that the motives of the two sides were quite different, for we were only doing what was right, proper, and necessary for our own defense, whilst they were disturbing the peace by indulging in wild schemes and extravagant ambitions. There are several distinct contrasts in that omnibus statement. Firstly, that their conduct was morally bad, ours morally good. About so national a dispute, it would be difficult to say anything that the world as a whole would accept. But there is some other alleged contrast as to which there is some hope of general agreement. It was asserted in the years 1912 to 14 that their motives were fixed and independent of our behavior, whereas our motives were a response to their behavior and were varied accordingly. Now, the same thing from an interview with a husband and wife. The husband says to therapist, from long experience, I know that if I want peace at home, I must not interfere with the way she wants things done. Wife, that is not true. I wish you showed a little more initiative and did decide at least something every once in a while, because, husband interrupting, you would never let me do this. Wife, I'd gladly let you. Only if I do, nothing ever happens, and then I have to do everything at the last moment. Husband to therapist, can you see? Things can't be taken care of. If and when they come up, they have to be planned and organized a week ahead. Wife angrily, give me one example in the last few years when you did do something. Husband, I guess I can't, because it's better for everybody, including the children, if I let you have your own way. I found this out very early in our marriage. Wife, you have never behaved differently. Right from the start you didn't. You have always left everything up to me. Husband, for heaven's sake. Then to therapist, I guess what she's talking about now is that I would always ask her what she wanted, like, where would you like to go tonight, or what would you like to do over the weekend? And instead of seeing that I wanted to be nice to her, she would get mad at me. Wife to therapist, yeah, what he still doesn't understand is that if you get this, anything you want, dear, is all right with me stuff month after month, you begin to feel that nothing you want matters to him. Now you have very much, I believe, the same mechanism at work here. They punctuate the sequence of events differently and come up with two different realities. And of course, if this happens, then almost invariably in human communication, the mutual charges of either madness or badness are being made. Same mechanism in an example taken from Lang and Esterson. This is an interview of a mother and a schizophrenic daughter. Shortly before her hospitalization, the daughter had made a very ineffectual physical attack on her mother. Daughter, well, why did I attack you? Perhaps I was looking for something I lacked. Affection? Maybe it was greed for affection. Mother, you wouldn't have any of that. You always think it's soppy. Daughter, well, why did you offer it to me? Mother, well, for instance, if I was to want to kiss you, you would say, don't be soppy. Daughter, but I've never known you let me kiss you. Here and again, the same kind of a strange thing. This sort of thing leads us, without great difficulties, up to the very interesting phenomenon of the self-fulfilling prophecy that is not strictly limited, of course, to interactional psychotherapy, but that you can easily find in individual therapy. That is to say,
you're going to say something about how to break into this sequence and stuff. Enjoying the sequence differently. It's an omnipresent problem.
It's an omnipresent problem. Now, I would have to...
And I suppose you may have demonstrated really people's work doing these. I just don't think people are used to think.
You're right. This makes it so difficult. Now, most of the meta-communicational implications of communication are very difficult to verbalize. In other words, the communication about communication is extremely difficult. What we are trying to do is we are trying not to get them to gain insight, and this is, of course, a subject I wanted to bring up much later, not to bring about insight by confronting them verbally with this kind of thing, or even by drawing this diagram or something, because this, as you can easily imagine, doesn't help very much. What we're trying to do is to make them behave differently. We try to prescribe behavior. And depending on the case, we can exchange the behaviors. We can say to the husband, all right, I want you to withdraw first before anything happens. If he carries this out, and it depends on the way you structure this prescription, the husband may, all by himself, gain some insight into this sort of thing, and the wife, of course, too. This is why we are being attacked by many, from many quarters, for being highly manipulative, which indeed we are. But this is, already perhaps anticipating a little bit questions of actual practical questions of therapy. Yeah. a few words on the self-fulfilling prophecy because it has such a interesting interactional implication. As you know, a self-fulfilling prophecy is an assumption I have about myself, which makes me behave in a way that the reaction I get from my surroundings are what I assumed they would be. For instance, if I assume that nobody likes me for some reason or another, it doesn't really matter why, but let's assume that I have this idea, nobody likes me, then I am, of course, going to behave in a way that is going to bear out my assumption. My behavior will be either very defensive or distrustful or cold or reserved or whatnot. And others will, of course, react to my behavior in a way that in my assumption I had already anticipated. So the behavior I think is their stimulus is really, but I'm blind to it, is really the response that I produce in the others. And here we are back at this problem of the punctuation of the sequence of events. Let me also mention that the same thing, of course, in a perhaps less noticeable way, is at work in the behavior of the paranoid person. A paranoid may force others, especially those close to him, into certain behavior that is supposed to prove to him that his suspicions are unwarranted. In other words, those close to the paranoid person will most likely try and reassure him that they don't want to harm him. Now, in his view, this confirms his point of view, because he reasons, if they weren't out to harm me, they wouldn't try so hard to convince me that they don't want to harm me. Therefore, I have here evidence for the fact, for the correctness of my assumption that others are out to harm me. Or take the depressed patient who does something very similar, structurally, essentially similar. The depressed patient notices the effect that his sadness, his depression has on others. He notices that those close to him, those who love him, are also sad because he is sad. This enormously increases his guilt feelings, because he now sees that he is doing something bad to them. This feeling of being bad to those who love him increases, of course, his guilt feelings, which in turn increases the reactions of those close to him, and may, of course, escalate to the point where the depressed patient feels that the only solution out of this is to execute on himself capital punishment for being so bad and making those who love him suffer so much through his badness. Let me read to you another example, which I think is worth reading out. It's taken from the latest book by Lang, Philipson, and Lee. Lang and Philipson at the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations in London. A.R. Lee here in private practice in Palo Alto. A husband and wife, after 8 years of marriage, described one of their first fights. This occurred on the second night of their honeymoon. They were both sitting at the bar in a hotel when the wife struck up a conversation with a couple sitting next to them. To her dismay, her husband refused to join the conversation, remained aloof, gloomy and antagonistic, both to her and the other couple. Perceiving his mood, she became angry at him for producing an awkward social situation and making her feel out on a limb. Tempers rose, and they ended in a bitter fight in which each accused the other of being inconsiderate. This was the extent of their report of the incident. 8 years later, however, we were able to tease out some of the additional factors involved. When asked why she had struck up the conversation with the other couple, the wife replied, "Well, I had never had a conversation with another couple as a wife before. Previous to this, I had always been a girlfriend or a fiancée or a daughter or a sister. I thought of the honeymoon as a fine time to try out my new role as a wife, to have a conversation as a wife with my husband at my side. I had never had a husband before either. She thus carried into the situation her expectancy that the honeymoon would be an opportunity to begin to socialize as a couple with other couples. She looked forward to this eagerly and joyfully. By contrast, her husband had a completely different view of the honeymoon. When questioned about his aloofness during the conversation, he said, "Of course I was aloof. The honeymoon to me was a time to get away from everyone, a time when two people could learn to take advantage of a golden opportunity to ignore the rest of the world and simply explore each other. I wanted us to be sufficient unto ourselves. To me, everyone else in the world was a complication, a burden, and an interference. When my wife struck up that conversation with the other couple, I felt it as a direct insult. She was telling me in effect that I was not man enough for her, that I was insufficient to fill her demands. She made me feel inadequate and angry." 8 years later, they were able to laugh at the situation. He could say, "If I had only known how you felt, it would have made a great difference." The crucial point is that each interpreted the other's action as inconsiderate and even deliberately insulting. These attributions of inconsiderateness and insult and maliciousness were based on hidden discrepant value systems and discrepant expectations based on these value systems, or, as I would propose to say, on a discrepant punctuation of the sequence of events and different kinds of attributions of meaning to these, to the sequence of events.
Does that have to do with punctuation?
Well, it has to do in the sense that we get the same kind of interference phenomenon, an emergent quality, a conflict that is due to the interpenetration or superimposition of two different ways of punctuating, just as the triads here, are reversed. Admittedly, they come up, or just as the couple here in the first example, they come up with very different views of the situation, and thereby, of course, punctuate, so to speak, the events differently and finish up in a conflict.
So what you say is punctuation can be a book analogous in many different content situations.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I don't want, yes.
In this case, it's symbolic. This is
Right.
it's
But you have to have them both, and you have to have this moire pattern, almost, that comes about from the superimposition of two different systems, just as in the example of the soldier and the English girls. There was a superimposition of two cultural value systems, out of which then arose an emergent quality in terms of the conflict.
thank you. Oh, this comparing this. You think? Well, this
So,
band is also
right.
a lot of other things that this thing.
You're correct, yes. My expectations about my partner's behavior, for instance, or my assumptions about how he sees me, all this comes into it and can produce. Even a verbal misunderstanding can produce the same thing. I had a very funny experience. I applied to the associateship at the Institute for Research in Psychotherapy at Temple University in early 1960. And I had my first interview was scheduled with Dr. Hoffman, who was then in charge. And I walked into the office at the appointed time, and I said to the secretary, "I have an appointment with Dr. Hoffman. My name is Watzlawick." And she turned around and looked at me and said, "I didn't say it was." I said, "But I'm telling you it is." And she said, "Well, why then did you say it wasn't?" Now, at this point, I immediately, of course, attributed badness to her. I thought I was being made the object of some sort of a stupid joke that I didn't quite understand, while she, as it turned out later, thought that I was a new schizophrenic patient of Dr. Hoffman's. Eventually, it turned out that instead of "my name is Watzlawick," she had understood "my name is not Slavic," which indeed she had never said it was. So here, I would still even put this under the rubric punctuation of the sequence of events. All right? Can I make the next step, or do we want to discuss this?
We got to make up sinful happy. First of all, and then it back to the take years. They're not in a situation,
It is quite possible. I would, however, surmise that if they still did the same thing to each other, they couldn't laugh, and they wouldn't understand it even now. They must have changed this in the meantime somehow. They must have understood that this kind of conflict can arise and what it is due to.
This is a good example. We were talking last week about the chapter in the book on the family by Spiegel on the resolution of role conflict. This is a good example of what they call cognitive role discrepancy. And perhaps if this was still a hot situation, well, one of the ways I think you could approach this is by going into what each of their expectation is of marriage. You might have begun to hit onto her discrepant expectations, what a husband does for his expectations.
All right, let me go on to what I consider a very important property, basic property of human communication, and that's the level structure. First of all, there is, to my knowledge, as yet, no clear-cut answer to the question, why do we communicate? On the most superficial, a most superficial answer would be, we have to communicate to exchange information, and we exchange information to get things done. But as you listen to people communicating to each other, you quickly realize that the actual information exchange is in everyday communications between two closely related people only a very small part of all the communication that these people engage in. In other words, especially married couples and families. Now, this has to do with a property of communication that I'm afraid I can suggest to you or define to you only in rather philosophical terms, in almost existential terms, and that is that for reasons that certainly are, for the moment, very unclear, communication somehow gives us a feeling of being real. It establishes and maintains a feeling of reality. William James, I believe, once said, let me read this out to you, no more fiendish punishment could be devised, even were such a thing physically possible, than that one should be turned loose in society and remain absolutely unnoticed by all members thereof. So what I'm trying to say at this moment is that there is definitely much more to the kind of communication that goes on, especially between closely related individuals, than merely the exchange of information, of factual, objective information. And to lead into this problem of what else is there in communication, I would like to present to you a rather charming, although a highly unlikely story. It's a riddle. And the riddle is that there's a prisoner is being held in a room with two doors, and he's watched by two guards. And the prisoner knows that one of the two doors, which are both closed, one of the two doors is locked, the other is not locked. He also knows that one of the guards always tells the truth, and the other always lies. And the prisoner is now promised immediate release if he can find out which door is unlocked by asking only one question. And I tell you beforehand that I was, of course, totally unable to solve this problem. It's annoying because when you have the solution, it's so simple. But can you think of what this one question is?